Ayana was born under a sky painted with gold and crimson, the village elders later recalling how the first light of dawn touched her face as if nature itself had blessed her. From the very beginning, it was clear she was different. Her movements were precise, her laughter carried an unusual melody, and even as a toddler she would pause and study her surroundings with an intensity that made adults uneasy. She noticed things others overlooked: the subtle pattern of a bird's flight, the slight rustle of leaves signaling approaching rain, the hidden marks left by animals along the paths of the forest. Her curiosity was insatiable, her mind alert to the smallest mysteries of life around her. She did not simply exist in the village, she observed, understood, and remembered. And while her peers were content with the simple routines of the village, Ayana questioned, imagined, and dreamed. Her father, a quiet but fair man, adored her. He often said that her eyes held the wisdom of generations and the wings of untamed spirits. He encouraged her to explore, to ask questions, and to trust her intuition. Her mother, however, had died when Ayana was very young, leaving the girl in the care of a stepmother whose heart seemed incapable of admiration for anyone outside herself. From the moment the stepmother arrived, she had perceived Ayana not as a daughter but as a rival, someone whose very presence cast shadows over her own sense of importance. As Ayana grew, so did her abilities. She could climb trees with unmatched agility, trace patterns in the stars, and recall stories and lessons with remarkable accuracy. Villagers began to notice her talents, quietly praising her cleverness and wisdom in whispers that her stepmother could hear if she listened carefully. Jealousy crept into the stepmother's heart like a poisonous vine. She saw in Ayana a reflection of all the power she could never attain and all the respect that would never be hers. Where Ayana was adored, she was scorned. Where Ayana's opinion carried weight, hers was dismissed. Every compliment the village offered the girl felt like an invisible cut to her pride. The stepmother's bitterness grew daily, subtle at first, a sharp word here, a critical glance there, but it became more overt over time. She began restricting Ayana's freedoms, assigning her endless chores and attempting to stifle her curiosity. But Ayana's spirit refused to bow. Even as she worked from dawn to dusk, she carried her dreams with her. In the small hours of the morning, when the village slept, she would sit by the river and imagine herself soaring above the trees, her arms spread wide, wings of light unfurling from her shoulders. She envisioned herself seeing the hidden truths of the world, the secret patterns in the lives of those around her, and the unseen forces shaping her destiny. Ayana's intelligence and intuition set her apart in ways her stepmother could neither understand nor control. She would ask questions that adults hesitated to answer, noticing inconsistencies in stories and behavior. When villagers spoke of strange occurrences, lost animals, sudden storms, or unexplained patterns in the forest, it was Ayana who pieced together clues they had overlooked. Her mind worked like a finely tuned instrument, interpreting the world not just as it appeared but as it truly was. People came to her for guidance, sometimes without realizing it, and her advice, though gentle, carried the weight of truth. Her stepmother saw all of this, and every recognition Ayana received became a fuel for envy. She whispered that the girl was dangerous, that her talents were unnatural, that her dreams of freedom would lead her to ruin. And yet Ayana did not falter. Even in the face of these quiet threats, she held on to her visions of flight, the metaphorical wings that no one could clip, not even her stepmother. Ayana's days were filled with observation and quiet learning. She watched her stepmother closely, noting patterns in her moods, her manipulations, and her methods of control. She studied her stepsisters as well, understanding how fear, desire, and ambition shaped their actions. She began to recognize the invisible rules that governed the village. How power was maintained through fear, how respect was earned and lost, and how secrets could protect or destroy. Every whispered conversation, every furtive glance, every gesture became a piece of a larger puzzle. And while her stepmother believed that confining her to household chores and cutting her off from others could suppress her, Ayana's mind remained untethered, soaring in the landscapes of her imagination and insight. At night, when the household was still, Ayana would stand by her window, gazing at the vast expanse of forest beyond the village. The trees whispered in the wind, leaves shimmering under moonlight, and she imagined them as guides, teaching her the language of the world beyond human sight. She envisioned herself running across the treetops, leaping from branch to branch and eventually lifting off into the sky, observing the hidden truths that lay beyond human reach. These dreams were her solace, a source of strength when her stepmother's words and actions tried to weigh her down. In these moments, Ayana understood a vital truth, that her spirit could never be truly confined, and that the wings she imagined were a reflection of her inner strength and courage. Despite the jealousy and oppression around her, Ayana's nature remained kind. She cared for the animals in the village, helped the younger children, and offered her knowledge discreetly to those in need. Her intelligence was paired with empathy, a combination that made her deeply respected by those who knew her, even if her stepmother tried to cloud that respect with lies and manipulation. Ayana's intuition told her that freedom and flight would not come from direct confrontation but from understanding, patience, and strategy. She observed the way the rivers flowed, the paths of animals, the cycles of the moon, and how these natural rhythms mirrored the opportunities and obstacles in human affairs. Each observation strengthened her resolve and prepared her for the day she would claim the life she was destined to live. Ayana's dreams of wings were more than fantasies, they were a compass for her journey. They represented the possibility of rising above oppression, of seeing the truth others could not, and of achieving the freedom that her stepmother sought to deny her. She imagined the sensation of soaring, the wind beneath her arms, the sun on her face, the clarity of seeing everything from above. Each imagined flight built her courage, shaping her mind and spirit to be unyielding in the face of adversity. The wings became a symbol not of defiance, but of hope, strategy, and self-mastery. As she grew, so did the tension in the household. Her stepmother's jealousy intensified, stepsisters became more resentful, and villagers began to whisper about the extraordinary girl with the eagle-like mind. Yet Ayana remained composed, studying her environment, noticing the subtle weaknesses in her oppressors, and planning for the moment she could act. She realized that true flight was not merely about physical movement, but about transcending fear, deception, and control. She would rise, not with brute force, but with intelligence, resilience, and the careful unfolding of her latent talents. The stepmother's envy began subtly at first, like a shadow stretching across the bright sunlight of Ayana's life. She noticed the way villagers would linger near the girl, asking questions, seeking advice, or simply watching her work with admiration. Elders who once walked with pride through the village would now nod respectfully to Ayana, listening intently to her observations and ideas. The stepmother could feel the invisible currents of admiration swirling around the girl, currents that she herself could not command. Every glance the villagers offered Ayana, every word of praise whispered in her presence, was a needle in the heart of her stepmother's pride. It was not just jealousy, it was fear. She feared that this girl, who moved with a grace and intelligence beyond her years, might one day surpass her influence entirely, leaving her powerless in the very home she had sought to control. The stepmother began to watch Ayana more closely, noting her every move, every smile, every act of kindness or intelligence. Where she had once dismissed the girl's abilities as trivial, she now scrutinized them with suspicion. Too clever for her own good, she muttered to herself on many evenings, pacing the cramped spaces of their shared home, her hands wringing the fabric of her dress. She began to confide in her allies, those in the village who shared her desire for control, those who feared or envied the rising influence of a young girl. Together they devised ways to suppress Ayana, to keep her from shining too brightly, to clip the metaphorical wings that were already beginning to stretch from her back. Rumors became their first weapon. At first they were small, almost imperceptible. Whispers of Ayana being proud, of her speaking out of turn, of her imagining herself more important than the village elders. But these whispers grew louder, shaped into stories that suggested arrogance, defiance, and even danger. She thinks she knows everything, some would say. She believes she is better than us. The stepmother ensured that every gathering, every market day, every communal meeting included a seed of doubt about Ayana. The village, though initially skeptical, began to notice the tension and question the girl's intentions, unsure where the line between youthful curiosity and presumption lay. Ayana, perceptive as ever, sensed the subtle changes in the air. She noticed the way her friends hesitated when she approached, the way conversations quieted when she entered a room, and the way her stepmother's eyes would glint with satisfaction whenever someone hesitated before praising her. It was an invisible prison, constructed of words and glances, slowly narrowing the spaces in which she could move freely. She felt the first true restrictions on her life, not in chains of iron or walls of stone, but in the manipulation of perception, the bending of reality to suit her stepmother's whims. Her confidence, once a natural extension of her abilities, now required constant reinforcement from within. Her laughter became quieter, her expressions more measured, and her footsteps more deliberate. Despite this, Ayana did not falter. She had always been observant, and she quickly began to map the web her stepmother was weaving around her. She noted which villagers could be trusted, which words and gestures were likely traps, and which spaces she could occupy safely. Each day became an exercise in navigating subtle threats while continuing to grow in knowledge and skill. She learned to speak in ways that were both truthful and measured, to smile without revealing vulnerability, and to act with kindness that could not be twisted into arrogance by those listening. The stepmother's efforts, though potent, were not invisible to Ayana. She understood that control was an illusion wielded by those who relied on fear and deception, and she quietly began to cultivate her inner strength to resist it. The stepmother's jealousy manifested in other, more personal ways. She began to assign Ayana endless chores under the guise of discipline, fetching water before dawn, cleaning spaces others neglected, or performing tasks designed to humiliate. Each command was a test, each restriction a method of teaching submission. But Ayana approached these tasks with a quiet intelligence, performing them efficiently, observing patterns in the instructions, and noting the reactions of her stepmother and stepsisters. While outwardly compliant, she was learning and strategizing, turning the intended oppression into an opportunity to study her household's dynamics and the village's social currents. At the same time, the stepmother continued her subtle campaign to isolate Ayana from allies. She whispered in the ears of other women, encouraging them to distrust or envy the girl, casting doubt on her character and intentions. Her stepsisters were instructed to mock and belittle Ayana whenever possible, amplifying her sense of difference and reinforcing the narrative that she was somehow other or dangerous. Each day, Ayana felt the weight of this coordinated effort, sensing the invisible chains tightening around her body and spirit. Yet within these constraints, her resolve solidified. She realized that the more they tried to ground her, the higher her mind could soar. Ayana's dreams of flight, once merely imaginative, became metaphors for resistance. She pictured herself with wings not to escape but to rise above the petty jealousies and manipulations surrounding her. Every whispered insult, every sly remark, every fabricated rumor became a current of wind beneath her imagined wings, propelling her to see further, think faster, and plan more carefully. Her stepmother's efforts, meant to suppress and control, inadvertently honed Ayana's awareness and patience, sharpening her perception of danger and opportunity alike. Through observation, patience, and intuition, Ayana began to recognize that the stepmother's greatest vulnerability was her reliance on fear and deception rather than truth and skill. By understanding the mechanisms of jealousy, manipulation, and control, Ayana learned that her strength lay not just in her abilities but in her capacity to endure, to watch, and to wait. She felt the invisible chains her stepmother had laid, but she also recognized their gaps, the weak points where cleverness and courage could take flight. In this way, Ayana's days under the shadow of jealousy became lessons in strategy, resilience, and observation. While her stepmother schemed and plotted, Ayana cultivated an inner freedom that no chain, rumor, or insult could bind. She realized that true power came from understanding, foresight, and the ability to rise above cruelty without succumbing to it. By the end of each day, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and the village settled into quiet, Ayana would stand on the hill overlooking her home, arms outstretched as if testing invisible wings, feeling a sense of preparation, strength, and purpose. Though the stepmother tried to restrict her movement, her confidence, and her voice, she could not suppress the innate brilliance of Ayana's mind, nor the soaring spirit within her. The girl born to fly was already learning the lessons that would allow her to rise above them all, readying herself for the day when her wings would unfurl fully, carrying her beyond the reach of jealousy, cruelty, and fear. Ayana had always moved through life with a sense of freedom that seemed as natural to her as breathing. Her laughter echoed across the fields, her curiosity led her to explore hidden corners of the village, and her intelligence drew people to her for guidance, advice, and companionship. But one morning, the balance of her world began to shift. Her stepmother, her envy and control now fully exposed, enacted her first direct attempt to ground Ayana, to clip the wings that had always seemed symbolic of her uncontainable spirit. It started with small decrees. Ayana was no longer allowed to attend the village gatherings that had once welcomed her presence. Where she had previously been celebrated for her knowledge of herbs, her skill in weaving, and her keen insight into village matters, she was now told to stay at home, to perform chores and to remain unseen. The first morning of this restriction, Ayana awoke to the heavy weight of invisibility pressing against her chest. Her stepmother's voice, sharp and commanding, echoed through the house. "You will stay here. You have no place among the others today." The words, simple and direct, carried the force of imprisonment. Ayana felt frustration and confusion curl through her like icy tendrils, constricting her chest. She looked to her stepsisters, hoping for some sign of solidarity, But they only smirked, clearly delighted that the focus of admiration was being removed from their sight. The realization that her freedom could be curtailed by someone so petty and cruel struck her deeply. Yet even in this first encounter with limitation, Ayana's mind refused to accept defeat. She noticed the subtle expressions on her stepmother's face, the way she relished the enforcement of control, the way her eyes lingered on Ayana to watch her spirit falter. She saw the patterns in her household, the careful surveillance, the methods used to limit movement and influence, and the small gestures meant to instill fear. Each restriction became a lesson in the mechanisms of power and control, revealing the invisible chains her stepmother wielded to suppress brilliance and confidence. Ayana began to observe not only her family but also the village itself, noticing who whispered in approval of her stepmother's commands and who remained silent, perhaps in fear or complicity. The removal of her access to communal gatherings was more than just a physical limitation. It was symbolic of a broader attempt to limit her voice and agency. Where she had once been able to interact freely, to offer insight and be heard, she now faced barriers both visible and unseen. Villagers who had previously sought her counsel were subtly redirected by her stepmother's influence. Invitations that might have been offered to her were intercepted. Questions that could have reached her were answered with misleading information. Ayana quickly understood that this was not merely about keeping her at home, it was about controlling perception, isolating her from potential allies, and undermining her influence within the village. Despite the frustration and the occasional sting of humiliation, Ayana responded with quiet observation. She began mapping her family's behavior, noting patterns of jealousy, manipulation, and coercion. She identified which villagers were most susceptible to the stepmother's influence, and which ones might be approached carefully for guidance or subtle support. Each small interaction became a data point, a piece of a puzzle that allowed her to understand the full scope of the suppression she faced. Even as her body was restricted to the household, her mind explored the terrain of social influence, strategy, and resilience. Ayana also learned to monitor the reactions of her stepsisters, who were eager to please their mother and assert dominance over her. They mimicked the stepmother's cruelty, sneering at her when she attempted to speak or act outside the confines of her restricted space. Yet their actions were predictable. Ayana noticed the moments when they faltered, when their own vanity and desire for attention made them slip into mistakes. She mentally catalogued these weaknesses, understanding that even in oppression, opportunities could emerge for clever and calculated action. The young girl's intuition also deepened during this period of restriction. As her physical freedom was curtailed, she became more sensitive to subtler currents of information, the way voices dropped in conversation when she entered a room, the fleeting glances exchanged when her stepmother thought she was not watching, and the whispered fears of those who might be sympathetic but too intimidated to speak openly. These observations sharpened her perception, teaching her the value of patience, discernment, and the timing of action. She realized that restriction did not equal impotence. Knowledge was a form of freedom, and understanding the networks of influence around her could give her a power that brute force or obedience could never achieve. The first few days of limitation were punctuated by internal struggle. Ayana experienced moments of despair, wondering if her talents and potential would ever find space to flourish. The sting of being prevented from participating in communal life, of having her natural curiosity and spirit constrained, was profound. Yet within this struggle, a spark of determination began to grow. Each restriction, each attempt to suppress her voice, reinforced her desire to find a way to soar despite the obstacles. She began visualizing strategies, contemplating secret routes, and imagining how she might turn every act of oppression into a lesson or advantage. By observing her family and villagers, Ayana learned not only about the weaknesses of her oppressors but also about the complexities of human behavior, the subtle interplay of fear, envy, loyalty, and pride. She recognized that her stepmother's efforts relied heavily on perception and manipulation. Remove or challenge the perception, and the foundation of control wobbled. The girl who had once dreamed freely of wings now understood the mechanics of the metaphorical chains trying to pin her down. She saw clearly that strength lay not just in overt abilities but in strategic thought, patience, and the courage to endure temporary restraint while planning for eventual liberation. As the days progressed, Ayana's inner freedom expanded even as her external freedom contracted. She practiced patience, developed observation skills sharper than ever, and nurtured a sense of quiet determination that could not be broken by fear, rumor, or restriction. Every denied opportunity became an opportunity to learn, to plan, and to prepare. In her mind, she stretched her wings even when her body was confined, soaring above the petty schemes of jealousy and oppression. By the end of the first week under the stepmother's imposed limitations, Ayana had transformed the experience into a powerful lesson in resilience, strategy, and foresight. She understood the first attempt to ground her was only a test, a preliminary trial to see if she would bend under the weight of control or rise in spite of it. And rise she would, for the girl destined to fly had already begun preparing for the moment when her wings would take her beyond the reach of cruelty, manipulation, and fear. As Ayana's stepmother grew more fearful of her growing talents and influence, her cruelty escalated, becoming both deliberate and symbolic. She realized that the girl's spirit, intelligence, and natural charisma could one day overshadow her own control over the household and influence within the village. Determined to maintain dominance, she devised methods to restrain Ayana, aiming to clip her wings in every sense, limiting her freedom, undermining her confidence, and isolating her from opportunities that could allow her to soar. The first step was physical restriction. Ayana was forbidden from participating in village gatherings, traditional ceremonies, and even casual games with other children. Where she had once moved freely through the marketplace, greeted villagers warmly, and learned from elders, she now faced closed doors and guarded paths. Her stepmother watched her movements, stationed herself strategically, and employed her stepsisters as spies, ensuring that Ayana could not slip beyond observation. Even small freedoms, like wandering to the river to draw water or exploring the nearby forest for herbs, were now curtailed. Every restriction served as a symbolic trimming of her wings, designed to prevent her from stretching herself beyond the walls her stepmother imposed. Public humiliation became another tool in the stepmother's arsenal. At meals, she belittled Ayana in front of the villagers, commenting on her modest dress, her quiet demeanor, or her perceived failures. She forced Ayana to carry out laborious chores that no one else performed, making her an object lesson in submission and obedience. Villagers witnessed these scenes, some feeling pity, others quietly disapproving, but fear of the stepmother's wrath kept them silent. Each moment of ridicule was calculated to diminish Ayana's sense of worth, an attempt to ensure that even her dreams of soaring would seem impossible under the weight of shame. Isolation added another layer to the oppression. Her stepmother ensured that Ayana had minimal contact with peers or mentors who might offer guidance or encouragement. The stepsisters, indoctrinated by jealousy and manipulation, often mocked or avoided her, leaving her alone with the endless burden of restriction. In this solitude, Ayana was forced to confront her fears, doubts, and frustration. The world beyond the house seemed both distant and inaccessible, and yet, in that distance, the girl felt a magnetic pull toward freedom, an innate understanding that her wings could still stretch if only she discovered how to use them. Despite the harshness of these measures, a spark of defiance began to ignite within Ayana. She realized that the stepmother's attempts to suppress her did not erase her talents or diminish her courage. In the quiet of her room, she would close her eyes and envision herself soaring above the village, above the forest, and above the limitations imposed on her. The spark, small at first, fed on memories of her secret explorations, moments of quiet triumph, and the inner strength she had cultivated during her restricted days. Every cruel word, every act of isolation, seemed to strengthen her resolve rather than diminish it. The rain of oppression did not fall without effect. While it sought to weigh her down, it also revealed paths and strategies that her stepmother could not anticipate. Ayana began to notice patterns in the stepmother's cruelty, predictable timings, weaknesses in the household defenses, and cracks in the stepsister's obedience. She realized that these restrictions, while intended to ground her, were also providing her with opportunities to study, plan, and cultivate resilience. Every limitation, every insult, every moment of enforced stillness became part of her preparation, sharpening her intuition and teaching her the art of subtle resistance. Within the walls of control, Ayana's dreams of flying remained untamed. Though her movement was restricted and her spirit tested, she discovered that true freedom could begin in the mind, manifest in small actions, and grow quietly into powerful strategies. The act of clipping her wings had paradoxically strengthened her desire to soar, fueling her determination to reclaim her full potential when the moment was right. Even as the stepmother's oppression loomed, Ayana nurtured her inner wings, knowing that one day she would rise above the cruelty, above the fear, and above the limitations imposed on her. The spark of defiance glowed brighter with each passing day, an unyielding reminder that no act of suppression could truly diminish her spirit. She had been forced to confront betrayal, humiliation, and fear, yet in that confrontation she discovered the strength to endure, the courage to resist, and the quiet power of dreams that cannot be grounded. As Ayana endured the relentless restrictions imposed by her stepmother, she began noticing subtler rhythms and messages in the world around her. It started with the wind, brushing softly against her face as she stole brief moments outside, slipping past her stepmother's gaze. The rustling of the leaves seemed deliberate, almost conversational, carrying faint murmurs that she could not yet understand but instinctively trusted. There was a cadence to the movement of the branches and the way the treetops swayed, as if nature itself was offering encouragement to her spirit, reminding her that the world was larger than the confines her stepmother tried to impose. Birds became her secret allies. Ayana noticed how they moved in patterns, flying freely above boundaries she could not cross. Their sudden flights and shifts in direction often mirrored her own thoughts, guiding her attention to hidden paths, quiet spaces, or opportunities to act. She began to recognize the different calls of birds and how they changed according to the time of day, the presence of predators, or the shift of seasons. In their songs she found hope and inspiration. The birds were messengers of freedom, reminding her that her wings, though unseen and restricted, could still soar if she learned to read the signs around her. The clouds themselves seemed to offer counsel. Watching them drift, shift, and reshape, Ayana perceived lessons in patience and adaptability. A cloud that seemed to stall would eventually change course, just as obstacles in her life could be navigated with ingenuity and perseverance. Patterns in the sky mirrored patterns in the village. When the clouds moved strategically, she saw analogies to the stepmother's own movements, teaching her to anticipate the timing of actions and reactions. Nature became both a mirror and a guide, reflecting her limitations while also suggesting paths toward liberation. Even small, overlooked phenomena carried messages. The way rain collected in puddles and drained in channels, the hidden paths of ants across the earth, the glimmer of moonlight through cracks in the trees, all became symbols Ayana interpreted. Each observation strengthened her understanding of her environment, showing her that freedom was not solely about physical movement but about awareness, strategy, and courage. She realized that limitations imposed by others could be countered by ingenuity. The more attentive and perceptive she became, the less the stepmother's restrictions could bind her. These whispers of the wind also nurtured Ayana's inner resolve. Whenever despair threatened, a gentle breeze or the song of a bird reminded her that she was not powerless. Nature itself seemed to cheer for her resilience, affirming that patience, observation, and creativity were wings in their own right. Ayana began to plan quietly, integrating the lessons of the natural world into strategies that would eventually allow her to move freely, reclaim her space, and rise above the oppressive control surrounding her. Through the wind, the birds, the clouds, and the earth, Ayana learned that true freedom is often discovered not in open skies alone, but in the ability to perceive, adapt, and act with courage. Even when her stepmother tried to clip her wings, the subtle guidance of the world around her gave her hope, teaching her that ingenuity, patience, and keen observation could transform limitation into opportunity. One quiet morning, as the sun began to pierce the mist that hung over the village, Ayana discovered a narrow, almost invisible trail leading away from the familiar paths she had always known. The path was partially hidden beneath overgrown bushes, twisted roots, and moss-covered stones, as if nature itself sought to conceal it from the eyes of those who would limit her. Her heart raced with a mix of fear and excitement, for she sensed that this path could offer the freedom and solitude she longed for. Step by cautious step, she began to follow it, feeling a thrill of independence and discovery she had never known before. The secret path wound through dense thickets, over gentle hills, and along streams that sparkled with clarity, offering both guidance and inspiration. Along the way, Ayana observed the harmony of nature, the interplay of light and shadow, the delicate balance of predators and prey, and the quiet rhythms that governed the forest. Birds flew overhead in precise formations, signaling shifts in the wind. Squirrels and small animals scurried along the branches, crossing invisible lines of safety and danger with impeccable timing. She began to understand that the forest operated on principles of patience, observation, and strategy, lessons that mirrored the challenges she faced at home under her stepmother's watchful eye. At the heart of the trail, the ground began to rise sharply, forming high cliffs overlooking the forest and the distant village. Here, Ayana found open spaces where she could move freely, practicing the skills she had honed in secret, the agility she had developed by navigating narrow alleyways, the balance gained from climbing trees, and the precision of her observation. The cliffs offered her vantage points to see beyond immediate obstacles, teaching her the value of perspective. From this height, she could watch the movements of the village, noticing patterns in the stepmother's routines and the subtle alliances formed by others. Each visit strengthened her strategic mind, helping her plan how to reclaim her freedom. The secret path also became her sanctuary for reflection and meditation. Sitting at the edge of the cliffs, she would close her eyes and imagine her wings unfolding, stretching toward the sky above. She envisioned soaring over the village, rising above the cruelty and envy that had bound her. Each imagined flight was more than a daydream. It became a mental rehearsal for courage, creativity, and independence. In these moments, the path transformed into a metaphorical wing, a foundation upon which she could rebuild her confidence and daring, readying herself to rise above any obstacle. Moreover, the path taught her patience and timing. Every twist, shadow, and hidden nook required careful navigation, forcing her to slow down, assess, and plan her movements. She realized that freedom was not always about rushing forward. It was about understanding when to act, when to wait, and how to align her efforts with the natural flow of the world around her. The forest, cliffs, and hidden trail became both teachers and allies, offering lessons that her stepmother could never anticipate or control. Through repeated visits, Ayana's secret path became a sacred space where she could cultivate her talents, sharpen her instincts, and grow her inner strength. It was a place where she could reclaim her wings, literally and figuratively, preparing herself to rise above the oppression that had sought to clip them. The hidden trail was no longer merely a path through the forest, it was the foundation for her ultimate freedom, a conduit to resilience, ingenuity, and the soaring spirit that no stepmother could ever suppress. As Ayana ventured deeper along her secret path, she began noticing subtle signs of life that seemed almost magical in their intent. Tiny animals appeared at the edges of her vision: foxes, rabbits, and birds, each behaving in ways that drew her attention to hidden trails, safe passages, or subtle dangers. A fox paused and looked at her before darting into the underbrush, and Ayana instinctively followed, discovering a narrow route that avoided the steep rocks ahead. Small birds chirped in sequences that seemed like a coded language, signaling the approach of storms or alerting her to the movements of other creatures. Slowly, she realized that the forest itself was alive with intelligence, subtly guiding her steps. The whispers in the wind became her most trusted teachers. At first, they were faint and indistinct, rustling through leaves in a manner that almost seemed coincidental. Over time, Ayana learned to listen closely, interpreting the wind's murmurs as lessons. Sometimes the wind carried warnings, like a sudden gust pushing her away from unstable ground. Other times it offered encouragement, swirling around her as if celebrating a successful climb or a clever maneuver. The whispers reinforced her growing understanding that patience, observation, and trust in herself were essential to navigating both the forest and her constrained life. Glowing signs in the natural world further strengthened her connection to the forest's guidance. Bioluminescent fungi, the faint glimmer of fireflies, and reflective puddles of water lit hidden routes in the dim forest light. Ayana learned to recognize the subtle differences in brightness and movement, understanding that these signs were signals pointing her toward opportunity or safety. Each flicker became a small lesson in awareness and attentiveness, teaching her that the smallest details could hold immense power. Through these interactions, Ayana began to internalize the forest's lessons. She realized that freedom was not granted by others but cultivated through resilience, courage, and strategic thinking. The forest taught her that even when she felt constrained, the world held invisible pathways for those perceptive enough to find them. She started to envision her dreams of flight not as distant fantasies but as attainable goals, recognizing that the spirit of her wings existed within her, ready to be realized when the time was right. Even as her stepmother attempted to limit her, Ayana felt strengthened by the forest's subtle mentorship. The lessons she received, trust in her instincts, patience in the face of adversity, and courage to act when necessary, helped her see her oppressor's control as temporary and surmountable. Each whisper, each guiding animal, and each glowing sign reminded her that true power comes from understanding one's environment, observing without fear, and believing in oneself. By learning to read the forest, Ayana grew more confident, agile, and strategic. She could navigate the challenges ahead with grace, aware that while her wings might appear clipped to those who sought to suppress her, her spirit remained unbound. The forest's guidance was more than just direction. It was a symbol of the potential for freedom, the quiet lessons of resilience, and the promise that even when grounded, one could prepare to soar. Ayana spent days and nights quietly observing her stepmother, her eyes scanning every gesture, every glance, and every subtle interaction she had with the villagers. She noticed patterns that had gone unseen by others: the way her stepmother hesitated before giving orders, the slight tremor in her hand when she believed no one was watching, the moments when her allies faltered under pressure. Each detail became a piece of a larger puzzle, revealing vulnerabilities that could one day be turned into opportunities. Ayana realized that the key to reclaiming her freedom lay not in open defiance but in patience, observation, and strategy. She began mapping out the routines of the household, noting when her stepmother left the compound unattended or when her stepsisters were distracted by trivial tasks. Every daily chore, every interaction with villagers, and every moment of complacency became a clue for potential openings. Ayana understood that her oppressors were powerful not because of their strength but because of the ignorance and fear of those around them. By gaining insight into their habits and limitations, she could create moments where she could act unnoticed, quietly building momentum for her eventual liberation. In addition to observing her family, Ayana paid close attention to the villagers. She listened to conversations in markets, under trees and near water wells, noting which villagers were inclined to obey the stepmother blindly and which might be swayed by truth and reason. She realized that some villagers were not cruel but fearful, and that with careful persuasion, their support could be secured. Slowly, Ayana began forming mental alliances, identifying those she could approach discreetly when the time came to assert her independence. Ayana also started practicing subtle acts of independence within the household, small demonstrations of autonomy that would not immediately provoke retaliation but would strengthen her confidence. She retrieved personal items quietly, finished tasks according to her own methods, and learned to move through the household with discretion. These minor victories, though unnoticed by her oppressors, bolstered her resilience and sharpened her awareness of timing, patience, and precision. Her plan extended beyond immediate survival. Ayana envisioned a larger strategy, one that would ensure her freedom permanently and restore her sense of agency. She imagined reclaiming spaces that had been denied to her, asserting her voice in conversations where she had once been silenced, and confronting the stepmother with evidence of her manipulations. Each imagined step became a rehearsal, building the confidence and clarity needed to execute the plan flawlessly. By combining careful observation, discreet practice, and the knowledge she had gained from the forest, Ayana felt herself growing stronger, more capable, and more prepared. She knew the day of confrontation would require courage, decisiveness, and the ability to act without hesitation. The plan to soar was not merely about freedom. It was about reclaiming dignity, demonstrating intelligence, and asserting the power that had always been hers. Ayana realized that even as her wings had been metaphorically clipped, the strategy she had developed would allow her to rise above oppression, outmaneuver her enemies, and finally embrace the flight she had always imagined. The morning air was crisp and heavy with anticipation as Ayana prepared to enact the plan she had honed in secret. Every detail, every observation, and every lesson learned from the forest's guidance converged into this moment. Her heart raced with a mixture of fear and exhilaration, yet her mind was clear. She knew that to reclaim her freedom she had to act decisively with courage and precision, leaving no room for hesitation. The time had come to symbolically spread her wings and rise above the constraints that had bound her. Ayana moved silently through the household, observing her stepmother's routine one last time. She noticed the cracks she had long studied, the distracted glance, the slight overconfidence, and the subtle patterns that revealed when control faltered. Timing was everything. As her stepmother called for trivial tasks and her stepsisters busied themselves with petty disputes, Ayana seized the opportunity to move with purpose. Every step she took was deliberate, guided by the instinct and wisdom that had been nurtured in the secret groves and hidden paths of the forest. The first act of her liberation was reclaiming spaces that had been denied to her. She entered rooms she had once been forbidden to enter, retrieved items that had been hidden or withheld, and spoke with a confidence that had been suppressed for too long. Each small victory reinforced her resolve, each assertion of agency a symbolic extension of her wings. The villagers, some of whom had watched silently from afar, began to notice the subtle shift. The girl who had been subdued, silenced, and constrained was now moving with authority, grace, and determination. Her actions culminated in a public confrontation where she exposed the stepmother's manipulations, revealing the oppression, deceit, and fear she had wielded to maintain control. Ayana's voice, once quiet and cautious, resonated through the gathering. She recounted the lessons she had learned, the patterns she had observed, and the courage she had cultivated. In doing so, she symbolically lifted herself above the limitations imposed upon her, demonstrating that true strength came from knowledge, patience, and unwavering belief in one's abilities. As she stood in the village center, the first acts of her liberation sparked something powerful among the onlookers. Villagers who had long tolerated cruelty and oppression began to question the authority they had once obeyed blindly. Murmurs of realization spread, and a sense of collective awakening began to take root. Ayana's flight was not only personal, it inspired a ripple effect, encouraging others to challenge injustice, recognize their own power and reject fear as a tool of control. The forest's guidance, the whispered lessons of patience and observation, and the confidence built from small, careful actions all converged in this triumphant moment. Ayana felt the metaphorical wings she had imagined since childhood expand fully within her. She had learned that flight was not only about escaping confinement but about reclaiming agency, asserting autonomy and inspiring change. Her defiance was measured yet powerful, her courage tempered by wisdom, and her victory complete not just in freedom but in the awakening of those around her. By the time the sun broke through the clouds, casting light on the village, Ayana's presence had become a beacon. The moment of flight had arrived, not merely as an act of rebellion but as a manifestation of resilience, intelligence, and hope. She had proven that even when others attempt to clip one's wings, the spirit can always find a way to soar above oppression, transforming constraint into liberation and inspiring those who witness it. Ayana stood at the edge of the village square, her presence commanding attention, radiating confidence and determination. Word of her defiance had spread quietly among the villagers, and now, as she faced her stepmother and the allies who had long conspired to suppress her, the air was thick with anticipation. Her stepmother's eyes widened in disbelief, recognizing that the girl she had sought to control had grown far beyond the limitations she had imposed. Ayana's posture was steady, her gaze unwavering, signaling that the moment of reckoning had arrived. The stepmother tried first with intimidation. Her voice, sharp and commanding, demanded obedience and submission. She attempted to belittle Ayana, reminding her of the perceived misdeeds and weaknesses she had once enforced to maintain control. Yet Ayana remained calm, listening carefully to every word, every tactic, and every attempt to provoke fear. She had learned that fear only holds power if one allows it, and she refused to give the stepmother any leverage. Ayana's knowledge, painstakingly gathered through observation, patience, and careful listening, became her primary weapon. She spoke with clarity, recounting incidents and manipulations that had once been hidden or dismissed. She detailed the stepmother's schemes, her attempts to isolate and humiliate, and the ways in which she had manipulated both family and villagers. Each revelation was precise and irrefutable, leaving no room for denial. The villagers, some of whom had been uncertain or fearful, began to murmur in realization, recognizing the truth of Ayana's words and the injustice she had endured. Support from her allies bolstered Ayana's position. Trusted villagers, discreetly enlisted over time, now stood alongside her, ready to attest to the stepmother's cruelty and to ensure that her power could no longer dominate unchecked. Their presence amplified Ayana's voice, turning what might have been a private confrontation into a communal acknowledgement of truth and justice. The stepmother and her accomplices, confronted not only by Ayana's courage but also by the collective awareness and support of the village, found themselves powerless. Ayana's confidence in her abilities, honed through secret practice, forest guidance, and her inner resilience, allowed her to remain composed throughout the confrontation. She did not shout or rage. Instead, she spoke with measured authority, demonstrating that intelligence and patience can outweigh brute intimidation. Every word, every pause, and every gesture reinforced the turning of the tide. By the end of the confrontation, it was clear to all that the balance of power had shifted. The villagers saw that cruelty, envy, and oppression could be overcome by courage, wisdom, and perseverance. The stepmother, stripped of influence, could no longer dictate the lives of those around her. Ayana's triumph was not merely personal, it was a lesson for the entire village, showing that even when others attempt to ground one's spirit, resilience and cleverness can ensure that the wings of freedom are never truly clipped. The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting a gentle golden light over the village, but Ayana's heart carried a weight far heavier than any dawn could lighten. Today was the day she would reveal everything: the truth of her stepmother's schemes, the years of oppression, and the cleverness she had cultivated to survive. The villagers had begun to gather quietly, some curious, some hesitant, but all sensing that something monumental was about to unfold. Ayana took a deep breath, steadying herself, and allowed her resolve to settle firmly within her. She began by recounting her early days of promise, the gifts and talents she had been born with, intelligence, agility, and intuition that set her apart. She spoke of the admiration she had received from elders and peers alike, the small joys of discovery, and the dreams she had carried of exploring beyond the village. But her voice, calm yet resolute, soon shifted to the darker reality of her life: the envy and cruelty of her stepmother, the calculated attempts to suppress her, and the isolation imposed by her stepsisters. Every whispered insult, every stolen opportunity, every restriction that had been placed upon her was revealed, and the villagers listened in stunned silence. Ayana explained how the stepmother had attempted to ground her, to clip the metaphorical wings that symbolized her freedom and potential. She described the public humiliations, the restrictions on her movement, the manipulation of villagers' perceptions, and the schemes designed to make her feel powerless. Yet Ayana's tone carried neither bitterness nor hatred. Instead, it reflected clarity, courage, and understanding. She demonstrated how patience, observation, and intelligence had allowed her to navigate these challenges, slowly reclaiming agency and turning the stepmother's tactics against her. With each revelation, Ayana paused to gauge the reactions of the villagers. Eyes widened as the truth became undeniable. The elders who had once hesitated to intervene nodded knowingly, realizing how they had been misled by fear and rumor. Mothers whispered to their daughters and fathers to their sons, understanding at last the subtle dangers of unchecked envy and the cost of complacency. The villagers began to see the mechanics of oppression laid bare, how fear and intimidation could manipulate perception, how silence could conceal cruelty, and how courage, even when quiet and patient, could illuminate the truth. Ayana moved from recounting the past to demonstrating the present. She showed how she had used the guidance of nature, the whispers of the wind, and the lessons of the forest to anticipate and counteract the stepmother's schemes. She illustrated her careful planning, the hidden allies she had cultivated, and the subtle ways she had reclaimed control over her own life. The villagers, inspired by her strategy and resilience, began to recognize the profound wisdom in her approach. It was not merely about survival, it was about understanding, patience, and the application of intelligence to overcome injustice. The turning point came when Ayana revealed the stepmother's public failures, the lies exposed, the manipulations undone, and the vulnerabilities that had been concealed by fear. She explained that those who attempt to clip the wings of others ultimately reveal their own weaknesses: fear, insecurity, and dependence on domination to maintain control. The villagers, now fully aware, began to understand the courage required to rise above oppression, and the strength inherent in standing for truth and justice. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the village had shifted. Conversations once dominated by fear or complacency transformed into discussions of wisdom, fairness, and communal responsibility. Ayana's story became both a warning and a lesson, that cruelty, envy, and attempts to suppress the potential of others are not sustainable, and that intelligence, courage, and perseverance will always illuminate the path to freedom. In sharing her journey, Ayana not only vindicated herself but also empowered the village. She had shown that resilience and insight could overcome even the most calculated attempts at suppression, and that those who tried to ground others ultimately betrayed their own limitations. The villagers now saw her not merely as a girl who had endured hardship, but as a leader, a guide, and an example of how one could rise above adversity with dignity and skill. As the gathering dispersed, a quiet reverence lingered. Mothers smiled knowingly at their children, young villagers glanced at Ayana with admiration and hope, and even those who had once doubted her now regarded her with respect. Ayana had transformed the village's understanding, turning whispers of oppression into songs of triumph. She had proven that the spirit, once nurtured with wisdom, patience, and courage, could soar above any attempt at suppression, inspiring all who witnessed her flight.